They used to call us the Mirror Boys. When we were children, people would stand between us and laugh because they couldn't tell which one of us they were looking at. We learned how to share clothes, secrets, heartbeat rhythms. There's a small, ordinary violence in being indistinguishable from someone else. The world folds you into easier packages: teachers, cousins, the neighbor's child, and sometimes it likes the package so much it keeps it. For most of our lives, that was harmless. For most of my life, it felt inevitable. His name was better for a long time. He was louder, where the world rewards volume. He took up air like a person taking up a stage. He learned how to be public before he learned how to be kind. That mattered to other people. Later it mattered to investors. Later it folded into a brand. I, who had been quieter, who had kept my fingers in the work, who had loved doing things properly for reasons that had to do with the thing itself rather than who looked good in front of a camera, became a footnote in a story everyone else wanted to tell. I had a girlfriend then, slightly older, bright, measured, the kind of person who read whole books before deciding if she liked them. She liked me because I listened, because when she described a dream job in a sentence, I could sketch a plan for how she'd get there. She loved the small ironies. How I spelled her name wrong on purpose once, and watched her chuckle. When my brother found us, he laughed, and told a story to make her laugh harder. He stole her the same way a thief steals a shadow, by being a louder version of something that was already there. She left one autumn in a cab with his name in her phone. That loss hurt in the way most simple human things do, with the pressure behind the chest and a recurring taste of bitter coffee. But it was not the hinge of everything. The hinge was more mundane and more devastating. He took my work. We were both in the same industry. I had started in product design and quietly built prototypes in my spare room, sketches on napkins, late-night CAD files, the slow work of learning what a thing should actually do rather than what a thing looked like in other people's slides. I had clients. I had modest awards for quietly clever solutions. My brother had charm and 2 business cards and a talent for translation. He could make a technicist's idea sound like prophecy. One year, he was on the roof with me putting up a banner for a small launch, and the next month, he had a keynote at a conference. He took my prototype, he rephrased the pitch, and because the room wanted spectacle, he got the standing ovation. The press photo showed him with my product in his hands and my name in the tiny print as contributor. In small ways, the theft was painful. In big ways, it was a shapeshift. He began to absorb my network, the whole little constellation of people who had once been my orbit, clients who had liked the simplicity of my designs, manufacturers who trusted the care I took with tolerances, investors who liked the story of 2 brothers with complementary gifts. He turned those into brand deals. He turned my effort into a public identity. I left. Not in the melodramatic sense, in the measured sense. I left the launches, the press junkets, the bottles of champagne with my name printed on them. I left dinners where I'd be introduced as the brother of. I left because there is a peculiar cost to being a ghost in your own life. You begin to thin like paper, and one day, someone will try to fold you into something and tear you. I could have screamed. I could have shown up on stage and said, "That is mine." I could have sued the first time and made headlines. I did none of those things immediately because truth has a shape, and I was learning that shape. I needed 2 things, distance and tools. I left the city and I read law in the evenings. I took night classes and I signed up for small contracts where I could rebuild a portfolio on my own terms. The slow accumulation of competence calms a person in a way that revenge cannot. In the months I was away, he became a company. It's the slippery thing about modern ego. If you are loud and likable and have a glossy brochure, people will persuade themselves that you are more important than you are. He signed spokespeople, he hired a PR team, he polished the company's website until it shone like a mirror. The brand took on the name the world liked best. He would be the face, and I would be the straightforward hum of the engine under the hood. A hum my brother learned to use in his speeches without crediting the instrument that made it sing. When people ask how one rebuilds after a life is stolen, they usually want a story of confrontation. But living spectrally has a patient logic to it. You can either reappear like a ghost and make a mess, or you can become something your pawns can't recognize until it is at the table. I chose the latter. For 3 years, I let him play the hero, and I taught myself to become useful in ways he underestimated. I took contracts his company blew off as boring. I took the clients who wanted simple, honest work and treated them like family. I learned the legal architecture of corporate control. I learned how patents are written and how agreements are parsed. I learned to write shareholder letters that feel like tender memos and looked exactly like what people found trustworthy. And then an ordinary thing happened. His company collapsed inward on itself. It was not dramatic. It was arithmetic and vanity and the peculiar corruption of success. One product line failed because a supplier had substituted cheaper components. Another launch was delayed because the PR team overpromised and the engineering team had not been allowed to speak. Investors began to ask questions. The SEC began to ask them a different kind of question about disclosures and who had ownership of what. There were murmurs and anonymous blog posts, and then an auditor, patient and bureaucratic, who loved nothing more than spreadsheets. I watched all of this from a distance, not because I enjoyed it, but because it let me see how the world actually moves. The public idol he had become is not invincible. It can be litigated, rewired, and, more importantly, it can be slippered away from you by the people who own the shares behind the curtain. A brand is a person in a suit until someone proves it is only cardboard. He failed at one vulnerable, human thing too: control. He had been careless with contracts. He had not signed the proper assignments. He had not closed the loop. He had been given the ridiculous gifts of charm and negligence, and together, they undo even the most expensive PR. I had spent 3 years learning how to read the paper the world hides behind to make a thing look credible. That knowledge is not sexy. It is not punchy for a headline, but it is effective. When the auditors called him to account, he turned on the charm the way a drowning man turns on his arms. He gave interviews where he laughed too much and said things about growing pains and miscommunications. The headlines softened where possible, but the real damage was not in a single story. It was in the erosion of faith among the investors. People who had wanted to believe his version now wanted to protect what they own. They wanted enforceable agreements, assignations in writing, not the warm glow of a smiling figurehead. It was then that I began to act. Not with fire, not with denunciations, but with forms and motions and exactness. I acquired a small stake in his company through the patient purchase of shares in secondary markets, shares no longer worth the myth, just the corporate weight. Legally, these were clean purchases: cash, brokers, standard KYC. There is power in being a small shareholder so long as you accumulate enough smallness. I read terms and found a clause about independent board nominations. When a certain percentage of shareholders petition, I said nothing publicly. I nudged other shareholders with well-placed questions, and I arranged private conversations where numbers did not look as attractive as they once had. When the dust settled enough to get people's ears, I proposed a reorganization. I did not propose it as anger. I proposed it as salvage. The company could be saved, I said, with new governance and audit transparency. The board called for votes. The shareholders, tired of the uncertainty, voted. I nominated competent men and women from a line of firms I had quietly befriended over the years, the sort who keep their suits pressed and their mouths disciplined. I proposed an internal audit overseen by counsel I had recommended. I took the steps carefully because the goal was not to humiliate. The goal was to replace a fragile FOD with durable institutions. He protested with the measured outrage he had perfected on television. He issued statements and his PR firm drafted op-eds that read like pastoral letters. He called me an opportunist in an interview and smiled with the kind of practiced hurt that reads well on camera. The public likes villains who are theatrical. They like an underdog, and they like a fall. But the law likes paper. The auditors found what the spreadsheet suggested. His creative bookkeeping was not creative ways of saving cash. It was an elaborate set of misallocations designed to make his margins look healthier than they were. Vendors had invoices that no longer matched deliveries. Bonuses had been paid to shell companies. He had promised intellectual property rights that had never been properly assigned to the company because the assignments were signed in ways that suggested the real inventor me had ceded them. 4 lawyers in gray suits sat me down and said, "If you want to pursue this, you'll need chestfuls of copies." I already had them. I had been assembling the set for years. No one likes what comes next. You file a claim and lives are rearranged. You file a patent suit and public documents become a theater of dry, dull revelation. You do it with the math in hand and the language exact. That's what I did. I filed to reclaim patents that he had fronted as the company's possession but which, under existing signatures and prior contracts, remained mine. I asked for injunctive relief to block certain product lines from being sold as proprietary while this was in dispute. The papers are a slow blade. They do not make noise, but they make movement. He responded theatrically, with despair on camera, and barely concealed anger off it. He made claims about betrayal, about the cruelty of a brother. Who would do this? It was enough to rouse sympathies at cocktail parties. It was not enough to sway the bank accountants. The board, now wary and composed of people who read reports for pleasure, implemented the changes I had suggested. They appointed an independent CEO. They asked for a retreat of the brand's image in favor of rigorous operational reform. He was asked to step aside temporarily. The market punished the company's PR. The ticker slid. Investors who had been friendly for the sake of a story now asked for real reports. I did not take his name out of spite. I took it out of logic. There is a legal act, prosaic and domestic, called a change of name. People do it for marriage, for immigration, for convenience. In our state you fill forms, you state your intent, you declare no fraudulent purpose, you publish notice if the court requires it, and you receive an order. It is, in essence, a small ceremony of bureaucracy. I petitioned in plain language and paid the filing fee. I did not hide. I listed reasons that were not dramatic professional continuity, correction of clerical errors, personal affirmations. They sound like small things because they are small things, but they are also the kind of thing that gives you the rope to climb a mountain without people noticing you were carrying it. Legally assuming his name did not make me him. A name is a tool of identification, a key, and the public significance it bore was a construct of the marketplace. I took the name because the company that bore it was no longer functioning with integrity, and because the legal effect of being the person named in certain assignments and in certain trademark registrations matters. It matters because when a person who once led a company is legally recorded as someone else, the subsequent chain of ownership, assignments, and claims goes through processes that can be clarified. In short, it cleaned the architecture around which his claim spun. People asked why I did it. Isn't it petty? An anchor said on a morning show when the story had become words. Isn't it vengeful? Another wrote in a column. The answer is simple. I did it because life had offered me a chance to tidy the mess in a way that the law recognizes. It was not theft. It was a legitimate change following all procedures. The public narrative can label it symbolic. The legal record calls it administrative. Administrative things change the world more often than dramatic pronouncements do. When I legally adopted his name, I also legally filed the corrections to the patent office that demonstrated the true inventor's assignment had been misinterpreted. I provided affidavits and prior drafts that showed the progression of prototypes, not just theatrical photos but time-stamped files, emails to vendors, test logs. I passed them to the board and, when the courts permitted, to the public. I didn't shout. I published. I used the architecture of bureaucratic truth. A name on paper combined with the weight of a date-stamped design history is immovable in the face of a spin. He watched the filings and the quiet updates on the company's web portal like a man watching snow melt off a roof. First the investors who were interested in governance left, then the marketing teams, then the partners who liked his smile. It was not glamorous. It was slow. It was merciless in the steady, arithmetic way of a machine counting down. He tried to salvage his reputation with the charity gala and a video apology that sounded like a speech written by marketing and regret colliding. People clapped, and then they left. People will clap to end an awkward scene. They will also clean their hands after clapping. In the end, the case was settled. The company restructured. The court recognized the priority of certain patents and ordered equitable assignments. He was barred from representing himself as founder of certain lines for a period. He made payments he could barely afford. The board replaced several executives. The brand scaled back, and where once the public had seen a single charming actor, we now saw a set of disclosures and directors and auditors. The story of two brothers was retold in footnotes and financial statements. I did not walk into his life wearing his suit. I walked into a courthouse with forms and into boardrooms with copies and into public registries, where the law turned and the truth took on the tone and color of officialness. That is not a cinematic revenge. It is a patient, legal, and if I may use the word with both modesty and intent, decisive reclamation. I reclaimed the right to have my work recognized. I reclaimed the contracts that had been misassigned. I reclaimed a measure of peace. After the settlements, I returned to what I preferred: quiet work, honest invention, steady emails at hours most people find inconvenient. I reconnected with the girlfriend who had once loved me because she liked how I listened. We had both been younger and had made choices then that we would not make now. That part of it was strangely small in the scale of everything else. We are human, and we repair what we can. She and I did not make a show of reconciliation. We drank coffee and spoke in the half-light of a kitchen. It was unglamorous, and it was enough. When the press wanted a closing shot, they asked for him, and for me standing under floodlights like two actors in a play. He declined. Public exposure is a theater, and he had already learned that the theater is often where the last scraps of dignity are traded. I did not go. I let the legal record be my voice. If people wanted to read a headline, they could. Twin brothers in corporate dispute. They did. But the headlines are short and the footnotes last. I changed my name legally, and I used the law to unpick the tangled things he had wound around my life. That is an odd kind of theft for some people to hear, taking his name. But names are instruments of recognition, and I used the instrument the law permitted to set right a serial misattribution. There was no masquerade. There was paperwork, witness statements, auditors, and, when necessary, judges with the terrible and sacred power to turn lies into corrected records. Sometimes people will ask me if I felt triumph when it was over. The feeling is not triumph. Triumph flares and burns and then makes you showy. What I felt was something more akin to gravity returning to place. There is a heaviness to rightness that is not celebratory. It is simply fitting. A thing that was crooked becomes straight. It is not loud. It is merely easier to stand under. The brother lives in a smaller world now, less media, fewer deals, fewer invitations to panels. He writes longer apologies and shorter emails. He occasionally sends messages that read like someone testing if there is salt in the water. We do not speak. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks me monstrous. Sometimes I think he does not think about me at all because he is preoccupied with error mitigation and debt spreadsheets. Either way, his life is not the theater it once was. I rebuilt my work under the legal right to be recognized, and then I continued to design. I teach apprentices now. I show them how to document their steps, timestamps, prototypes, versions, emails. I teach them how to be slow and careful with their paper, because the thing you love is always most at risk where the world would make it pretty for show. I teach them honesty. I tell them that quietness is not weakness. Sometimes I tell them, simply, to record their work in places that outlast charm. People love a cinematic end to a story. They want the man to walk away with a slow turn and a victorious soundtrack. That is not how this works. This is how it actually worked. Patient study, legal forms, careful purchase of shares, boardroom motion, audit, paper, court. The revenge was administrative. It was boring in public. It was absolute in effect. There is a small thing I do on the anniversary of the last phone call, where I begged for credit and he would not give it. I go to the shop where I once bought prototype parts and I buy a spool of wire. I pay cash. I walk home with it in my jacket pocket, and I feel the weight of the small, honest things in my chest. Then I go into my studio and I make something. The work is quiet, and it is mine. If you must have a moral, here it is. People who take your life do not always strip you of what matters most. They can take photos, speeches, and the applause, But they cannot, in the end, take the facts you have kept in your own hands, the dated files, the prototype logs, the emails that show you started before they arrive. Keep your record. Stay careful with the small things. Do your work so that, if the time comes, you can show it in plain white paper, and let the law and the slow arithmetic of truth do the rest. I did not want him to suffer spectacle. I wanted to be recognized. When the world finally corrected its ledger, I did what I had set out to do. I took what was legally mine. I fixed the attribution, and I walked forward with a name that had once been not mine, but that the legal system now recognized as mine. I did it calmly, and I did it without rage. That is the only revenge I ever wanted, a life remade, and the world made to call it by the right name.